Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mary Grant, and I'm the president of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, and it is a pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. Tonight, in partnership with the Irish Consulate of Boston, we are pleased to host 1919 to 2019, de Valera in Boston and 100 years of Ireland-U.S. relations, an important reflection on the centennial of Eamon de Valera's monumental speech at Fenway Park. This enlightening conversation would not be possible without the generous support from the Government of Ireland and the incredible team that we have in working with the Consul General's office in Boston. And so I'm just thankful for that and welcome all of you here this evening. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So great to, all right, that's great. So thank you all. I appreciate that very much. With every program, we aim to get closer to the mic and speak a little louder. And we do that because we value having robust programs and engaged discussion here at the Institute. And every day at the Institute, we welcome visitors from across the country to participate in full-scale Senate programs and to engage their voices in democracy. So this is an exciting place. When Senator Edward Kennedy envisioned the Institute, it was evenings like this that he had in mind. The senator was a strong and passionate advocate for Ireland, its rich culture and tradition. He had a special love of the country, a deep relationship with the people that were so much a part of his family history and his long political career. He would have loved this program this evening. He was also a baseball fan, so Fenway Park would have had a special significance for him. This evening's talk will reflect on the 100th anniversary of de Valera's historic address to the city of Boston and to 50,000 people who packed into Fenway Park as he shared his vision and made a call for support. I'd like to take a moment because in this room this evening there are a number of public officials who have joined us from organizations, from community organizations, elected officials. We are delighted and honored to have all of you here with us. Thank you for your service and thank you for making a difference in Boston and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's a pleasure to have so many public officials with us this evening. We do have a distinguished and engaging panel this evening, and it's a true pleasure to have Ireland's ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Daniel Mulhall, joining us once again. Thank you, Ambassador, for being with us this evening. Thank you very much. We're also joined by Damien Murray, Catherine Shannon, and David McCullagh. Thank you all for being with us and for bringing your knowledge and expertise into this evening's discussion. And a special thank you to Kevin Cullen for moderating tonight's discussion. Kevin, it's always a pleasure to have you join us at the Institute. Thank you for being with us. As we begin this evening's program and discussion, it is my honor to introduce and welcome to the podium and to the Institute Consul General Laoise Moore. Laoise joined the Irish Consulate of Boston in May of this year after serving in the political division of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Dublin. Prior to that, Laoise served with the Irish Parliament on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome to the Institute, Laoise. We are delighted to have you here in Boston. We look forward to the many years of working with you. Throughout tonight's discussion, you're all encouraged to use the hashtag de Valera in Boston on Twitter. When the program concludes, attendees are invited to continue with refreshments in the lobby, and the bookstore is open where there'll be sales of the book that we will be hearing about this evening. Now I am delighted to welcome to the podium and into the Institute, Laoise. Laoise, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'll be sure to stand good and close to the mic too. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As the Irish Consul General in Boston, I'm very happy to welcome you all here tonight. Over the past few years in Ireland, we have been commemorating what we call the Decade of Centenaries, when we are remembering a series of remarkable events in the early 20th century that were to profoundly shape Irish history. And it is especially significant to be here in Boston this evening to mark the centenary of one of those memorable events which took place in 1919 in Fenway Park when Eamon de Valera, as Mary said, addressed a crowd of around 50,000. This was as part of his 18-month tour of the United States. De Valera was making the case for Irish independence, and he was greeted, reports say at the time, by ecstatic crowds at Fenway Park. This illustrated that city's close links with Ireland, and as a Consul General who, as Mary said, only took up duty in May and has been, over the past few weeks, received just an incredibly warm welcome. I'm very, very glad that the warmth of those relations between Ireland and Boston continue to this day, and it is a relationship that we in Ireland really greatly treasure and value. So I would like to thank you all very much in the audience for coming here tonight to be with us here for this commemoration, to remember that very special event which marked an inflection point in US-Ireland relations. And we are so grateful to the Edward Kennedy Institute for partnering with us and for providing this amazing venue for tonight's discussion. And I also, of course, want to thank our distinguished speakers, especially our keynote speaker who traveled from Ireland to join us. Dr. David McCullagh is something of a household name in Ireland, where he's a prominent news and current affairs broadcaster with RTE, Ireland's national public service broadcaster. He's a presenter of Prime Time, which is, I think it's fair to say, the preeminent current affairs TV program, and he also presents This Week, a news and current affairs program on RTE Radio. When he's not filling the nation's airwaves, Dr. McCullagh is a historian and a biographer, and he's the author of several notable books on Irish history, including most recently Valera's life and career from 1882 to 1975. And I actually believe that some copies of that book are available in the bookshop here. So, ladies and gentlemen, I can think of no more suitably qualified person to give tonight's keynotes address to kick off the commemoration of that historic day at Fenway Park. So please join me in welcoming Dr. David McCullagh. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here, and of course to the Kennedy Institute for this fantastic space. We're here tonight to talk about Eamon de Valera and his lifelong connection with America, which is always incredibly important to him for political reasons, because support he gained here in America helped him defeat his domestic rivals, for financial reasons, because the money he collected in America allowed him to fight elections and establish the Irish Press newspaper, but also for emotional reasons, and I'm going to get to those in a moment. But the immediate reason for tonight's event, as has been said, is the centenary of de Valera's first visit to Boston on June the 29th, 1919, when he addressed the first of many massive crowds on his American tour at Fenway Park. Now, I know Fenway Park is a place of some cultural importance here in Boston. So I was asking a pal of mine who's from here but living in Ireland now, was there any sort of local reference I could work in, or maybe a joke about the Red Sox? And he went quiet and he said, we don't joke about the Red Sox. And he gave me some advice. If you're talking about Fenway Park, he said, don't mention the curse of the Bambino. Don't mention Bucky Dent's home run over the Green Monster in 1978. And whatever you do, don't, under any circumstances, mention the New York Yankees. So let's talk about a more welcome visitor, and we'll let the Boston Globe take up the story, which Kevin tells me is a very good, very fine newspaper in those days as it is now. And it reported, Eamon de Valera, President of the Irish Republic, got a reception such as no other Irish patriot ever received in Boston. To say that it was thrilling is putting it mildly. It was electric. The heart and head of the people of Irish blood were in it. The Globe reported that 50,000 people, twice the expected number, poured into Fenway Park, with thousands more on the streets outside. And this is at a time when the average attendance in Fenway Park at a game was about 9,000. And even the World Series win over the Chicago Cubs the previous year had only attracted 15,000. No doubt if they realized they'd be waiting so long for the next World Series, the more people might have turned up. But anyway, here's the Globe again. At times it looked as if there would be a panic around the platform that had been erected for the speakers and guests at the home plate. The jam became so great that several women fainted and had to be carried onto the speaker's platform. The size and the enthusiasm of this reception was a triumph for the organisers, for Irish America, and most of all for Eamon de Valera. Despite this, the Globe, curiously, didn't report much of what the Irish leader actually said. It concentrated instead fed on the speeches of better-known figures such as local Senator David I. Walsh. But perhaps the Globe reporter suggested De Valera's low profile was actually an advantage. This is what it says: the very mystery which attaches to this man, who was comparatively unheard of until recently, somehow fulfilled the dreams of the race, that some great figure would arise at the crucial moment and lead Ireland to freedom. So who was this man who inspired such devotion among people who barely knew him? And to answer that question, we have to go back to the start of De Valera's American story, which of course did not begin in Fenway Park. In fact, Edward de Valera, as he was christened, was born in Manhattan in October 1882 and lived in New York City for the first 2.5 years of his life. His mother was Kate Call, a young woman from rural County Limerick who emigrated to the United States in 1879 and worked in domestic service in Brooklyn. And there she claimed to have met a Spaniard, Vivian de Valera, and to have married him in New Jersey in 1881. Now, no record of their wedding has been found, nor is there any record of Vivian's death in the first half of 1885, which is what Kate said prompted her to send her son to Ireland. There have been questions about Kate's story, about whether she was really married, about whether Vivian really existed. And those questions greatly bothered de Valera. Throughout his life, he made many efforts to find proof of his parents' marriage, to no avail. So for whatever reason, young Eddie was sent away from his birthplace to be raised in this labourer's cottage in Brewery in Limerick by his grandmother, and after her death, by his uncle. Although he would never admit it, he appears to have felt abandoned by his mother, who even after she remarried and had 2 more children, made no effort to bring young Eddie to live with her. Here's an extract from a letter to his Aunt Hanny, who'd also gone to America, written in March 1896 when he was 13.5 years old. One of his closest friends had just left the neighbourhood and he was feeling lonely and sorry for himself. And he wrote, "I am not content here. I would by far rather to be over, as I have no one to be with. It would not be a bad plan if Mama was writing to Uncle to say to send me over with someone that was going soon, and perhaps he might let me go." But his mother did nothing about his request. De Valera had to make his own way through his own efforts. He persuaded his uncle to let him go to secondary school, or high school, a rare privilege at that time for someone of his background. And he won a scholarship which took him to the prestigious Blackrock College. Now you can see him, the studious young De Valera. He's the only one in that group photograph who's holding a book. And you can see he's keeping his place with his finger so he can get back to studying as soon as the photo is taken. He became a teacher. This was taken when he was teaching at Rockwell College, and he took up the Irish language to help his career. But the language became much more important than that for him, giving him a new identity, a new name, Eamon instead of Edward, and even a wife, Sinead Ní Flanagan, who had been his Irish teacher. By the time he turned 30 in 1912, he was a respectable member of the middle class with a wife and a growing family, and he seemed likely to live out his life in relative obscurity. But the following year, everything changed for Ireland and for De Valera with the formation of the Irish Volunteers. De Valera joined on the night they were launched in 1913 and rose through the ranks, becoming by 1916 one of 4 Dublin City Battalion commandants, and he was in command of the Boland's Bakery garrison during the Easter Rising. There's been a persistent myth that he was spared execution after the Rising because of his American birth, as the British, anxious to get America into the war, didn't want to upset public opinion here. In fact, De Valera survived through pure luck. After the 3rd Battalion surrendered at Boland's Bakery, instead of turning right to Richmond Barracks, where the courts-martial were held, they were brought to the left, to the RDS, where they were held for 3 days. By the time De Valera arrived in Richmond Barracks, he was at the back of a long queue for trial, and by the time he was sentenced to death, the public backlash against the executions had begun, and public opinion led to most of the remaining death sentences being commuted to life imprisonment. America re-enters his story in mid-1919. De Valera by then had been released from prison, elected MP for East Clare, and then president of Sinn Féin, the political party which swept the boards in the 1918 general election and then established the first Dáil. And then he decided to go to America. Now, it seems a bit odd that at a time when Irish nationalists were trying to set up an alternative government, he would decide to leave the scene of the action. But he had several good reasons for going. One was to raise money, of course. Another was to generate publicity, because publicity and propaganda were very important in the War of Independence. He also wanted to heal rifts among Irish Americans and to seek recognition of Irish independence. That last aim rested on the hope that President Woodrow Wilson meant what he had told Congress in February 1918. National aspirations must be respected. Peoples may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. But it was very clear from what Wilson said that he was thinking about self-determination only for some oppressed peoples, for the people oppressed by the Germans, the Austrians, the Turks, and the Russians. He wasn't thinking about self-determination for the subjects of his ally, the British Empire, and accepted that the Irish case should not be heard at the Paris peace talks. In any event, at the start of June 1919, De Valera was smuggled aboard the SS Lapland in Liverpool by the ship's boatswain Barney Downes, who hid him in the bottom of the ship, where he was undisturbed by police, but did have a cheese sandwich in his pocket, eaten by rats. De Valera was later so seasick that Downes thought he was going to die, but was able to revive him with a couple of drops of brandy. When he arrived in New York, there was no doubt about De Valera's first priority, as he made clear in a note to his colleague Harry Boland before he even stepped ashore. "I'm anxious to travel to Rochester tonight. Hope it can be managed." Rochester? Why Rochester? Because Rochester was where his mother was, 34 years after his exile from America and 12 years after her last visit to Ireland. His desire to see her was natural, though the urgency also suggests a desire to overcome his feelings of abandonment by displaying to her his newfound status. And here we see her later in the year listening to a recording of one of his speeches with his picture on the wall. "Look at me, Ma, top of the world." Of course, the American tour wasn't just emotionally satisfying because Mammy was watching. Anyone would have found it gratifying to be feted as De Valera was in 1919 and 1920. Here he is with Boland, arriving for his first public engagement at the Waldorf Astoria, one of New York's most prestigious and expensive hotels, where he was to be introduced to the media and which would be his permanent address for the next 18 months. After meeting the press, he met the people. We've already noted the massive crowd that greeted him in Fenway Park. Here he is in San Francisco, unveiling a statue of Robert Emmet. And he got similar welcomes in Chicago, New York, and other cities. It didn't seem to matter what he said, and perhaps that was just as well. According to a British official in New York, De Valera lacks personality, and even his friends say that his voice and hesitating speech disappoint many who expect a fluent orator. Never mind that, because the reception was wildly enthusiastic everywhere he went. He wrote home to Michael Collins complaining, "I spend most of my time shaking hands. I have the biceps of a blacksmith before I'm finished. Had I time, I'd get articles into all the newspapers. I'm out today in private house lent by a friend, may get some work done. Lord, as I write, here comes another visitor." In October, he began a comprehensive tour of the entire country. Moving rapidly from city to city, making the same speech over and over again was hard, relentless work, although there were compensations. Harry Boland succinctly and vividly described Louisville, Kentucky. "Darkened, bloody soil, lovely women, fast horses, strong whiskey." In fairness, De Valera probably wasn't interested in the women, the horses, or the whiskey, but he was delighted with a day on an Indian reservation in Wisconsin, where he was made a chief of the Chippewa Nation. In September 1920, he was back in Boston to address meetings on Boston Common and in the Mechanics Building, and he said he regarded it as unfortunate that the only work I can do for Ireland here in America was simply to talk. But talking, it appeared, was effective. A bond drive launched at the beginning of 1920 ultimately raised $5 million, around $65 million at today's values. That was one major success of De Valera's American trip. The other was in propaganda. De Valera managed to raise Ireland's profile massively, piling pressure on Britain to come to a settlement. But there were failures too. Washington didn't recognize the Irish Republic, and De Valera's efforts to influence the Republican and Democratic conventions in the summer of 1920 not only failed, they were actually counterproductive. So too was his impact on Irish-American unity. His bitter squabble with veteran Fenian John Devoy the chap with the beard, and Irish-American judge Daniel Cullen not only split the movement, it also left de Valera deeply suspicious and intolerant of opposition. And here's the paradox of his American experience, which boosted his ego, but also accentuated his insecurity, which may explain a lot about what happened after his return to Ireland at Christmas 1920. I won't attempt to rehearse the treaty split or the Civil War, except to point out the importance of American support, political and financial, for both sides. One of the ironies was that Devoy initially opposed the treaty because he assumed de Valera would support it, before reversing engines when he found Dev on the side of its opponents. When the Civil War was over and the anti-treaty side was turning to electoral politics as the way forward, de Valera looked to America for financial support. Before the 1923 general election, he wrote to an American friend, "Though I detest starting to send round the hat again, $100,000 is the smallest sum on which we could hope to put up anything like a decent fight." Evidently, he got over his scruples about fundraising rather easily. In 1924, the Free States man in Washington, Professor Timothy Smitty, claimed that the American people and press were no longer interested in de Valera outside a small, well-organized and articulate group of Irish Americans in New York and Boston. And it's true that Boston, like New York, always had a welcome for Dev. But he was more of a draw than his opponents like to admit. Between March 1927 and May 1930, he crossed the Atlantic 3 times to raise funds for his new party, Fianna Fáil, and then for the Irish press. He spent a total of 11 months in America in this time, and despite arriving on the last trip just after the Wall Street crash, he raised enough money to launch the Irish Press newspaper in 1931. A large chunk of the funds came from bond money that hadn't been sent home during the War of Independence. De Valera managed to persuade many of the holders to sign the money over to him to establish a newspaper to support his party, a paper, incidentally, which would remain in the ownership of his own family. And the Irish Press was crucial to De Valera getting into power in 1932. The Second World War changed the relationship between Dev and America because Irish neutrality and De Valera's apparently strict interpretation of it were extremely unpopular in the United States. The tension was most obvious in his relationship with this man, David Gray, the American minister to Ireland during the war. Related by marriage to the Roosevelts, Gray was well connected but extraordinarily undiplomatic. He came to detest De Valera, and the feeling was reciprocated. Gray's most famous maneuver was the American Note, demanding the removal of the German and Japanese legations prior to D-Day, in the confident expectation that the demand would be refused. He wanted to get De Valera on record refusing to help to diminish his future influence in American politics, and Gray got what he wanted. After De Valera said no, an opinion poll found that 71% of Americans were aware of his refusal, with 66% thinking the US should take further action, including 4% who believed Washington should declare war. Gray's continued goading led directly to De Valera's infamous visit to the German minister Edward Hempel to express condolences on the death of Adolf Hitler. Unsurprisingly, this caused a storm of protests from Americans, particularly Irish Americans. And here's a flavour of the sort of letters De Valera got. "We who were born in Ireland consider your condolences as an insult to the Irish. It's a pity the British didn't shoot you way back in 1917. And my own personal favourite, the Irish people should tar and feather you, you dirty bum." Gray had succeeded brilliantly in reducing De Valera's stature in the eyes of his fellow Americans, and this was demonstrated in 1948 when De Valera, out of office for the first time in 16 years, visited the United States as part of his anti-partition world tour. Irish Americans supported his demand for help to remove the border, but there was no sympathy from the wider community. The State Department pointed out the British were our allies in the late war. When Ireland's neutrality operated to the advantage of Germany, we do not propose at this point to take up the battle for Ireland against a valuable friend and partner. But De Valera and Ireland were not kept in the deep freeze forever. American self-interest dictated that Ireland should be included in Marshall aid, in moves towards European unity, and eventually in the United Nations a decade after the end of the war. The symbolic affirmation that Ireland and de Valera had been forgiven came in 1963 with the visit to Ireland of JFK. The two men planted commemorative trees in the grounds of the president's home, Áras an Uachtaráin. Kennedy, with his bad back, threw one spade of soil over the roots of his tree. Competitive as ever, the practically blind de Valera energetically shoveled several spades over his own. Kennedy ruefully remarked, "You are making me look awfully bad, Mr. President." An even greater sign of acceptance came the following year when de Valera made a state visit to the United States, including, of course, a stop here in Boston. He was received at the White House and addressed a joint session of Congress, not in the room of which this is a replica, of course, but in the other room down the hall. And he said, "I consider this an outstanding day in my life when I see accorded officially to our country the recognition that it was not possible to secure 45 years ago." Unlike in 1919, the independent Irish state was now accepted by the United States as a full member of the international community. De Valera's journey, which began in Fenway Park, had finally reached its destination. Thank you.
So thanks very much, David, for that fascinating and entertaining insight into de Valera and US-Ireland relations. So it's now time to move on to the discussion part of this evening. So I would like to invite the panelists and the moderator to take their seats. And while they do so, I'll say a few words of introduction. So moderating this evening's discussion will be Kevin Cullen, who I know needs no introduction to many of you. Kevin is a prominent journalist with the Boston Globe, and he has a very wide-ranging career. But throughout that career, Kevin has maintained a steadfast interest in Ireland and Irish affairs, and he covered the conflict in Northern Ireland for 25 years and was bureau chief in Dublin in the lead up to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Damien Murray is Professor of History at Elms College in Massachusetts. David was born and raised in Dublin and studied at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth and at Boston College. He has published numerous volumes on Irish and Irish-American history, including Irish Nationalists in Boston, Catholicism 1900 to 1928, and Romanticism, Nationalism, and Irish Antiquarian Societies 1840 to 1880. Catherine Shannon is Professor Emerita of History at Westfield State University, and she's published several books on Irish history also. In the 1980s and 90s, she was noted for her work promoting dialogue between nationalists and unionists in Ireland, and she has also published on the role of women in the peace process. Currently, she's researching Boston's reaction to the so-called Forgotten Famine of 1879 to 80 and the subsequent Irish Land War. And last, but certainly not least, is Ambassador Dan Mulhall. Ambassador Mulhall became Ireland's 18th ambassador to the United States in 2017. His previous positions include Ireland's ambassador in the UK, Germany, and Malaysia. And he was also press counsellor at the Department of Foreign Affairs during the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. The ambassador is also known for his social media profile and for his keen interest in Irish history and literature. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would ask you to join me in welcoming our moderator and our panelists, and I will now invite our moderator to take the floor and kick off the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Leisha. And I'd like to take this opportunity, I guess, for the first crowd in this town to welcome Leisha to Boston as the new representative of the Irish government. Leisha is from Swords, which is the East Boston of Dublin, because they have to put up with all that crap air traffic, but fine people in Swords. I want to go right back to David. Wonderful presentation. Your books I learned so much from, especially the idea that Dev, who I had always kind of sneered at, was this fellow that went through life seeking Mammy's approval, and he never had it. But one thing that I've noticed in this country, and it's fitting enough to say it in this setting, that we often say, what would have happened if Jack Kennedy lived? And in Ireland, you often hear what would have happened if Michael Collins had lived? And I wondered how much you thought about that and how much of Dev's Ireland would be different than if Michael Collins had lived. What was different about them?
Well, I suppose you could look at it the other way. What would have happened if Dev hadn't lived, if he'd been executed in 1916? People talk about De Valera's Ireland, and when they use that phrase nowadays, they tend to be thinking of a conservative, yes, a pejorative, conservative, backward-looking, enthralled to the church and all the rest of it. But I think, first of all, it's a mistake to think that De Valera created that Ireland all on his own. He was undoubtedly the most significant political figure of the 20th century, certainly of the first half of the 20th century in Ireland, for good or ill. And he certainly did more than anybody else to shape the country that Ireland is now, in terms of the constitution, in terms of the political system, in terms of the drive for independence. But he did not create Ireland. He did not create the social and economic conditions of Ireland all on his own. And the other thing, people nowadays don't really give him credit for the fact that he was, for instance, in the Constitution, didn't recognise the Catholic Church as an official state religion, did recognise the Jewish congregation in Ireland at the time, which in 1937 in Europe was quite a significant thing to do. And when he disagreed with John Charles McQuaid, the Archbishop of Dublin, a very powerful prelate, when he disagreed with him, he told him he disagreed with him, and he certainly, in comparison to some other political leaders, including John A. Costello, who I've written a biography of as well, De Valera was more prepared to stand up on issues than he's given credit for now. In terms of Collins, everybody has a romantic idea of Collins. Collins had the good sense to die young, which is not great for your lifespan, but is fantastic for your career. And talk about how Ireland might have been different under Collins. But Collins was, in terms of his economic policy as First Minister for Finance, completely accepted the British model of Treasury control and all the rest of it, which is not surprising. He had been trained as a civil service in the British Post Office. So he wasn't necessarily the more radical figure that people sometimes wishfully project onto him.
What I think was in your book that I wondered how many people in this audience would have thought that Dev was spared the firing squad only because he was born in America, and that's obviously a myth you blew up. I wonder if you could, I think another thing people might be well aware of is that when Hitler died, De Valera signed the Book of Condolences at the German embassy. Explain a little of that.
Well, he didn't sign the Book of Condolences because there wasn't a Book of Condolences. He paid a visit to express his condolences to Edward Hempel, who was the German minister in Ireland at the time. And the reason he did it was because the aforementioned David Gray had been annoying him for years, and in particular at that stage had asked for the German legation to be handed over to the Allies before Germany had formally surrendered, which was De Valera regarded as a piece of impertinence, and I'll show him. He'd also, Roosevelt had died a couple of weeks before, and on that occasion he had called to Gray to express his condolences. So he felt if he'd done it as neutral, if he'd done it for the Americans, he would have to do it for the Germans. He took the view that diplomatic relations are between states, not between governments, and therefore it doesn't matter how much you might disapprove of the leader of a particular state, you observe the courtesies. It led to a storm of protest. He wrote to the Irish minister in Washington at the time, Brennan, whose first name escapes me at the minute, and he's
Joseph Brennan.
Joseph, yeah, and he said, I feel I acted correctly and wisely. And you could make an argument that under diplomatic usage he had acted correctly. He certainly hadn't acted wisely. And the Department of External Affairs immediately set about, after he'd paid his visit, set about finding out what the other neutral states had done, and found to their horror that none of them had done something similar. So De Valera landed himself in it in a big way. And he was rescued from that sort of opprobrium at home and abroad by Winston Churchill's famous broadcast at the end of the war, in which he attacked Irish neutrality, gave De Valera the opportunity to make his own speech in reply, which restored his standing with Irish people, if not with the wider world.
Catherine, let me ask you, or just get your impression of this, that when De Valera came here to Boston, he was on a well-worn path. I mean, the Charitable Irish Society traces back to the 18th century. Parnell was here, and we had the good wisdom not to throw lime in his face. But talk about that when De Valera got here, there were established networks that he was able to exploit and appeal to.
Absolutely. And one thing, of course, that's very important is the sheer size of the Irish population and community here at the time of his visit. I looked at the censuses recently, and there was something like 340,000 native-born Irish and first generation in Massachusetts at that time, which obviously would have been a great target audience to receive encouragement to support Irish nationalism, both financially and morally. So the kind of diaspora demographics, I think, are extremely important here. But as you say, there was a very long tradition here in the Boston area, particularly from the late 1870s on, for people in the area to give support, and both financial and moral support, to Irish leaders. One of the first places that Michael Davitt came to sell his idea about the new departure, to use the land question as the issue that could bridge both the physical force nationalists and the constitutional nationalists together. He launched that idea in Boston and got the approval of John Bull O'Reilly, who was the editor of the Boston Globe. And shortly afterwards, the pilot, the pilot.
The Globe has never, ever been confused with the pilot.
But actually, speaking of the Globe was actually quite a supporter of the Irish land agitation, and was very condemning of Irish landlords for their neglect of their tenants and the British government's refusal to go in and try to do something to rectify the situation of the Irish tenants. Things were very, very bad in the west of Ireland at that time because of another potato crop failure that brought almost near famine conditions to the west of Ireland in 1879, 1880. So there was great need for relief, as well as for some kind of transatlantic movement that would enable the Irish politicians to defend the tenants from eviction. Eviction rates were rising very greatly. And at that time, what happened was they developed in the United States the Irish Land League. And that was going to be a source of huge financial support for the people in Ireland at that time. And one thing I do want to say about that is that the women of the Irish community got very active in Land League activity, and there were ladies' Land League branches, quite a few of them here in the Boston area. There were at least 4 in the city of Boston, a number in Cambridge, and others in other parts of the state. And the good ladies of Worcester raised $7,000 in 18 months to send over to Ireland, specifically to Anna Parnell, who was doing so much to assist those who had been evicted, and either with relief or building housing. So there was this huge, huge support that happened at that time. And then when Parnell switched to the Home Rule as the first priority, there was similar enthusiasm in supporting Home Rule and the Irish Parliamentary Party. As a matter of fact, by 1885, people thought Home Rule might be around the corner. As we know, it didn't succeed. And it was defeated again in 1893. And then there was the split in the Irish Parliamentary Party, which created kind of a void in the activism of people here, a void that was finally kind of healed in 1900 when the Irish Parliamentary Party got back together. And all the various groups here in the United States at that time, those who were on the physical force side, people coming out of Du Bois, Clan na Gael, as well as the Constitutionalists, people who would have been members of the Charitable Irish Society and the United Irish League of America, they joined forces to have a unified front in America to provide the financial support for Redmond's new party. And of course, after 1916, there was a similar crisis for constitutional nationalism. And I think one of the things that impressed me the most when I was looking over the newspapers of this period was in the 6 months before de Valera's visit, there were an incredible number of meetings here in Boston that were kind of dress rehearsals for Fenway Park. A meeting on Boston Common that drew 4,000 people in the first week of December 1918, just after Sinn Féin had won their election, which it was a great encouragement for people to give them support. They had swept 73 seats out of the Westminster seats. And then there was another meeting at Symphony Hall where a total of 8,000 people in the hall and people outside supported the Sinn Féin program of an independent Ireland, and particularly the idea of putting pressure on Congress and on President Wilson to make sure that Ireland's case was brought to the Paris Peace Conference. So in many ways, what happened at Fenway Park was a kind of natural progression of Irish American ability to kind of heal their rifts with one another over tactics at a crucial time and come together in support of the program that had the democratic mandate of the people in Ireland.
Thanks, Catherine. That's a perfect segue to Damien, because it wouldn't be Irish without a split. Damien, tell us about the split between Dev and the Irish-American leader, Dan Cullen.
Okay, so by the time de Valera arrived in June 1919, the dominant Irish-American nationalist organization is the Friends of Irish Freedom. It was set up just before the Easter Rising in 1916, and the main leader is a man called Daniel F. Cullen. He is a New York State Supreme Court Justice. And so in 1919, the Friends of Irish Freedom set up the Irish Victory Loan. But it reflects the increasingly American perspective of Irish America at this time. While they want to send help Ireland, the way they think they can help Ireland is by putting pressure on the American government to recognize the new Republic of Ireland. And in addition to that, they think that undermining the British Empire will also help Ireland. How do we undermine the British Empire? We also undermine the League of Nations. They were opposed to the League of Nations, which they thought was something that would help to maintain the British Empire, and believed that President Wilson was wrong to try and create the League of Nations. So for them, the Irish Victory Loan is really intended to take down the League of Nations and to undermine Wilsonian internationalism and hopefully help Ireland at the same time. So de Valera arrives in June 1919. He's authorized by the Irish Dáil to start a loan in the United States, and he wants that money. That immediately creates a rift between de Valera and Cullen. De Valera convinces Cullen and the leaders of the Friends of Irish Freedom to end the Irish Victory Loan in August of 1919 and to begin to lay the foundations for the Irish Republic Bond Certificate Drive. This is the drive that kicks off in early 1920, lasts for a year, and will raise over $5 million for Ireland, and most of that money then is earmarked to go straight to Ireland. Of course, only about half of it gets there, but still a significant amount of money. This is de Valera's greatest achievement in that sense, is that he manages to get Irish-American nationalist fundraising to be earmarked towards directly helping Ireland. The second thing that he wants to do is to get Ireland, the Irish Republic, recognized by the United States government. Again, this is where he falls out with Cullen. Cullen believes that to try and put pressure on the United States government to recognize a republic inside a territory of your closest ally is unrealistic. Instead, you should exploit Wilsonian rhetoric about self-determination, and then that would then put pressure on Britain. So this leads to some, should we say, disagreement between both. And I think that one of the greatest examples of that takes place at the Republican Party convention in June 1920. Cullen and de Valera could not agree on a common request for an Irish plank from the Republican Party convention. Cullen decides that he will go, and it's entirely inappropriate for the self-proclaimed leader of a republic that hasn't been recognized to turn up an American convention campaigning for recognition for his country. De Valera completely ignores him, brings all his people to Chicago, sets up office in the Blackstone Hotel, holds conferences, writes articles, organizes torchlight parades, to the extent that one of the newspapers had to put up a mock advertisement in the newspaper stating that, just for your information, Eamon de Valera is not running for the President of the United States of America. Cullen's moderate plank is actually voted for 7-6 by the Resolutions Committee. De Valera's plank, insistent on full recognition of the Irish Republic, is rejected 11-1. And when he hears about Cullen's plank being accepted, he issues a statement saying, "I'm totally against it," which causes the chair of the committee to change his vote, and now it's rejected. This is one of those moments when clearly the split is now public. It's talked about in newspapers, and it's after this then that de Valera proceeds to try and take over control of the Friends of Irish Freedom. Calls for amendments so that it will decentralize power from New York, and this again is part of this sort of like, Boston, New York rivalry. He relies heavily on his Massachusetts friends to push forward the amendment to try and break the New York standard control of the Cullen group. They reject it, and that's when he breaks away and forms his own organization, the American Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic. It just grows enormously. Within a year, it has over 700,000 members, 3 times as much as the Friends of Irish Freedom at its height. The Friends of Irish Freedom at this point is almost negligible, down to about 10 or 15,000. So in one sense, de Valera, when he leaves the United States in December 1920, he can claim that he has taken control of Irish-American fundraising, raised over $5 million, and has set up a new organization run by his supporters. But in another sense, he has failed to get recognition of the Irish Republic. So you can argue that it's a mixed bag that comes out of this 18-month tour. And in addition to that, he's also caused an enormous split within Irish Americans that was very bitter. And will probably have ramifications going down the years, okay?
Thanks, Damien. Ambassador, I'm curious what you think about the idea that Dev lays that marker down when he comes to Fenway Park and does this American tour. How much of the history, even to the current state of bilateral relations between Ireland and the United States, was kind of laid down there by Dev? How much of that survived?
Well, it wasn't laid down by Dev. It already existed for decades, generations before that. It seems to me, at least, that the foundation stone of the current relationship between Ireland and the United States was laid down by the Great Famine, because that was the foundation stone of the tragic, of course, incredibly traumatic experience for the Ireland of that time, and for decades and generations afterwards. The scars of the famine were visible. But it did result in an outflow of people from Ireland on a vast scale. And I was just looking at the figures. Between 1840 and 1900, 6 million Irish people arrived in America. Now, if you go outside to one of the displays here, which shows the population of America as it grew from the time of independence to the present day, you will find that by 1900, the American population hadn't even reached 70 million. So the Irish influx here was enormous by any standard. And what's more, the Irish came here with a sense of grievance, and they passed that down through the generations. They saw themselves as an exiled people. And not everyone in Fenway Park was Irish born. Many of them were probably children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Irish immigrants. So that tradition of Irish America having a deep concern for Ireland was established early on. And it's instructive that we always think about Thomas Clark being sent by the Fenians in America to organize the Easter Rising. He was the principal organizer of the Rising. Pierce and McDonough and those came late in the day to membership of the IRB. And we think of the funding that came, the impact of the Fenians here in the United States. But it's also true that the parliamentarians, they came in numbers. Every serious Irish parliamentarian paid a visit to the United States, to both because they got a boost here and they raised significant amounts of money for the cause at home. And not only that, last year I gave a lecture about Douglas Hyde's visit to America. As the president of the Gaelic League, he came to Ireland for 7 months in 1905-6. He raised $50,000 or $60,000, which is a lot of money in those days. He visited 55 cities and was feted wherever he went. So I think, and he was actually welcomed to the White House by President Theodore Roosevelt, who discussed his interest in Irish mythology with him. So across the board, Irish movements, cultural, political, parliamentary, insurrectionary, were all receiving both financial support, but also, perhaps more importantly, moral support, that Irish people, Irish nationalists, didn't feel that they were alone in the world. They had a powerful body of people in the United States who were their brothers and sisters and who shared their broad aspiration towards a better Ireland, towards Irish independence of some kind. So De Valera certainly, I mean, the fact is, it's remarkable that the leader of a revolutionary struggle would decide to travel 4,000 miles away from the scene of the action and spend a year and a half in the United States. That was a reflection of how important Irish America was to Ireland and to Ireland's struggle at that time. And that tradition has continued, because even though we're now a fully independent, sovereign, prosperous, successful state, many Irish Americans, I've met them all over this great country, not just in Boston, but in places like Charleston and Savannah and in Texas, still have a connection with Ireland that they feel in their bones and in their hearts. And for me, that's a huge boost for Ireland. And in recent decades, we've started to understand the value of that, and we've started to realize that it's something we need to work on and to cultivate. And that's why by next year, we will have 8 consulates in the United States. We will have as many consulates as the UK, France, and Germany, countries that are 15, 20 times our size. So De Valera was part of a continuum that goes on from the middle of the 19th century to the present day.
And that continuum kind of ended where you and I met, was in Northern Ireland many years ago. And Dev was prescient in thinking that you can raise all sorts of money from America, you can buy all sorts of weapons, but it wasn't until American political power and pressure was brought to Ireland in the face of George Mitchell and was in there that you really get to that result.
That's correct. I mean, of course, even if you go back into history, there was always that division between the sort of physical force movements that did get support from Irish Americans and the parliamentary movement, which likewise was heavily supported by Irish Americans. I think the key moment really was when John Hume and Senator Kennedy and people like that got together and decided that we had to find a way out of the apparently endless spiral of violence that started in the late 60s and continued really until the time that we were together in Dublin and Belfast. And it really was, I mean, I don't think anyone should underestimate the impact of Irish America on the peace process, because it was, what Irish America did was it brought the U.S. administration and the U.S. Congress into play, not as a partisan for Ireland, but as a sympathetic and powerful outside force. And I can remember being in castle buildings, those dreadful buildings in Belfast where the negotiations took place. You think they would have found a better set of buildings, but maybe they were trying to make sure we didn't get too comfortable there. You probably remember the coffee and the sandwiches outside for the press, which weren't very nice either. Sorry about that. It wasn't our job. That was the job of the British government in the Northern Ireland office. But anyway, you know, I can remember late at night, the word would go around. The White House is on, talking to David Trimble, Gerry Adams, John Hume, and so forth. In other words, at that time was Bill Clinton, most powerful man in the world, was on the phone to these provincial politicians in Belfast, urging them to make that final effort to secure peace. And that was powerful. And the other thing I would say is that tradition of Irish American and American interest in the Irish process continues to this day. We have one of the strongest caucuses of any country in the world in Congress today. The Friends of Ireland have 80 members or so. There's a delegation in Ireland this week from Congress. In fact, there are two delegations. There's one in Belfast and one in Dublin. So the interest is still there, and it wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the fact that Irish Americans, although they've changed enormously over the decades and generations, and Ireland has changed enormously too, but that sympathy, that interest in Ireland continues and has survived the test of time. And I'm one who's not in any way pessimistic about this. I think it's survived so long now. I believe this will keep going for as far into the future as I can see, because it means something to Irish Americans to have peace in Ireland and to see Ireland successful and prosperous, because in some ways it's a tribute to their ancestors who came here.
Very good.
I mean, they came from a desperately poor country, and that country has now been transformed into a modern economy and a modern society that Irish Americans ought to be and are, in my experience, proud of.
Thank you, Ambassador. We're about to move to questions from the audience, so I think I can get just one more question to our author and the reason we are here. David, did Dev love America, or did he just see it as necessary?
I had to think carefully about that one, won't I? I think he always sought. I mean, it was a source of immense strength to him in a partisan political way. It gave him the money, primarily the money in the 1920s and early 1930s, to fight elections, to set up a new party, Fianna Fáil. And if you look at the accounts for Fianna Fáil, it is by far the biggest source of funding for the party is from the States. There was Fianna Fáil's first election was in July 1927. There was then a snap election in September 1927 after the assassination of Kevin O'Higgins. And if Fianna Fáil had not been able to get the money to run that campaign, they were in serious trouble, and that's why the government called the snap election. They hoped they would be in serious trouble. And you see the account books, you know, £3,000 or from Boston, 5,000 from New York, or maybe it was the other way around, I'm not sure. You know, this money was immensely important. It was immensely important for him in establishing the Irish press, which was absolutely crucial to his political career. He said himself that if it hadn't been for the Irish press, Fianna Fáil would not be in government. And if the Irish press was to disappear, Fianna Fáil would very swiftly be out of government. It also gave me my first job in journalism, so, you know, a very fine institution altogether. But I think there was something more to it than that. I think in De Valera's mind, I mean, obviously it was the land of his birth. It was the land where the mother, who he felt had, in some senses, rejected him or abandoned him, was. There was always an emotional attachment to America, and that accentuated the importance of this country for him, I think.
Thanks, David. We're going to open this to questions, and there are members of staff, I believe, with microphones. So, there, yes, they are. And all game, the only thing you can't ask is why a Boston Globe subscription costs as much as it does. Sorry, Mr. Henry. Where are we going? Anybody get a question? This can't be an Irish crowd.
So, question for Dr. McCullagh. Growing up in Ireland and listening to Irish or learning about Irish history, learned a lot about de Valera, and even to this day I feel he's a very divisive character. So when I was in school, he was a very honourable person, led the country, was the chief politician for a long number of years. Then in more recent times when I've read about him, he's a very divisive character. And so can you describe how your view changed of him as you did your research, and how did you view him at the beginning, and how do you view him now?
Yeah, that's easy. I wouldn't have had a great deal of time for him to begin with, which might make you wonder why I spent 7 years writing the books. And the answer is because the publisher asked me to, so it seemed like a good idea at the time. I think, having looked in great detail at his own personal papers and all this sort of stuff, people often ask me, do I like him any better at the end? And I don't, not necessarily sure I do, but I certainly have more sympathy for him, both because of his upbringing, which I think had very harsh aspects to it, and also for what he did. Now, de Valera is often criticised for things he didn't do. He didn't radically reshape Irish society. He didn't, and the reason he didn't is because he didn't want to. He had one overriding aim, which was to assert, strengthen, deepen Irish sovereignty. And there is no doubt that he succeeded in doing that with the Constitution, with the gradual breaking of the links with the British Empire, the Commonwealth as it became known, with neutrality above all, which proved that Ireland was a sovereign, independent nation that could pursue its own path. But the downside was that it was the sovereignty of the state had been strengthened, but it was a 26-county state. De Valera would be horrified to think that he had made partition more difficult to resolve, but that in effect is what happened. At every point where there was, and he wasn't alone in this, at every point where there was a choice between deepening sovereignty or strengthening links with Northern Ireland, he opted for deepening sovereignty. And I think the effects of that are obviously still with us. But I think this is a very roundabout and long-winded way of coming to a conclusion, which is I think if we look at de Valera in terms of what he wanted to achieve, in terms of his background, in terms of the society which shaped him and which he in turn shaped, I think you have to recognize that he did achieve a lot that was valuable. Perhaps his failures can be, some of them at least, can be forgiven.
I'll just add there that when we talk about these things, assessing figures like de Valera, we're always inclined to think that there's some kind of gold standard against which you can judge de Valera, but you have to judge him, it seems to me at least, in the context of the time, because when Ireland became independent in 1922, its success, or indeed its survival, could not have been guaranteed. After all, it came into being following a 2-year war of independence, which was quite violent in its own way and divided the country in many ways. And then, of course, we had a civil war. And the fact that over the following 30 years, until de Valera retired from politics in 1957, Ireland became a stable democracy. Now, it may not have been everyone's ideal of an ideal Ireland, but it was certainly, in the context of the 1920s and 30s and 40s in Europe, to actually get to the 1950s in a condition where parliamentary democracy had survived, where the other states that were established in the wake of the First World War, most of them became dictatorships of some kind by the time the 1930s were over. So Ireland was a conspicuous success story, and that the credit for that has to be given to the first generation of Irish leaders, De Valera and also Cosgrave, who between them managed to steer Ireland through a very rocky period in European and global history, which could easily have sunk a country on such fragile foundations as ours was. Now, the downside, of course, was that economically, the country wasn't in great shape when De Valera stepped down. Emigration was at record levels. The population of the country had actually declined consistently from 1845 until 1960. But that was the first time when the population started to rise again. And it required a new generation of Irish people, or Irish politicians, to try to engineer our economic development, but without the political stability that De Valera's generation gave to Ireland, that economic development would not have been possible.
Unfortunately, I think we have time for one more question.
Thanks very much for being here. It's been a great event. I have just kind of curious about what De Valera would be doing today with Brexit and the amount of uncertainty that's coming through again, in particularly with the backstop. Would he be, if he was part of the government in Ireland, if he was part of the NFL, would he be in the U.S. right now banging the table saying we should have a unification vote? What do you think how would he respond to today's events?
Wouldn't be doing rugby commentary, I'll tell you that much.
De Valera would not be pushing a unity vote if he thought it would destabilize Southern society, I don't think. I think he would be looking to get the greatest possible amount of constructive ambiguity into whatever was being negotiated between the EU and Britain. And interestingly, he would not he would not be as enthusiastic about the European Union as nearly every Irish politician is. On the night New Year's Eve 1972, on the eve of Ireland joining the European Economic Community as it then was, he had the family around in the Áras for dinner, and he said to them, "I am the first and last elected president of an independent Ireland," which will let you know what he thought about European integration. But I think what De Valera would bring to a situation like this is a diplomatic skill at blurring the boundaries so that nobody would be entirely sure what he was up to, and nobody would be entirely sure what he had achieved by the time he had achieved it, but he would present it as in the absolute best interests of Ireland.
But also, I would say, De Valera, probably, you're right, he wasn't a great admirer of the European Union, as it was in 1972 when we joined. I suspect, though, he was also a pragmatist, ultimately. And a lot of people in Ireland were dubious about the European Union in 1972. But I think De Valera, like other Irish politicians, would quickly have realized the value of the European Union to Ireland, especially as he would have seen that the European Union offered Ireland an opportunity to break itself free from the shadow which had been cast upon Ireland since the 1920s of this overwhelming relationship with our nearest neighbour. He would have, I think, ultimately understood the value of developing our relations with our European neighbours and therefore diminishing somehow the influence of Britain on Irish affairs. Also, of course, De Valera was a great advocate and a great enthusiast for the League of Nations in the 1930s when he chaired the League of Nations and took a fairly strong stance. So I think he would have matured, I think, in his assessment of the European Union based on the facts of its benefits for Ireland. By the way, this is the second strangest question I've ever been asked about Brexit over the last year and a half. The strangest one of all was I was at Georgetown University a few months ago giving a talk on James Joyce's Ulysses. And to a group of students, of course, Joyce was born the same year as De Valera, so they were exact contemporaries. But the first question from one of the Georgetown students was, what would James Joyce have made of Brexit? There you are now.
So we have to do a Dexit, and I was asked to point out that the greatest concentration and gathering of Irish-born people in Fenway Park since Dev was there has occurred when the Gaelic Players Association brought the national game of hurling in the form of Super 11s to Fenway Park. So the next time they're there, please turn out, and we'll remember Dev. And first, I'd like to thank the panel. And I would ask Dr. Grant to come back up and finish the evening.
Thank you, Kevin. How about a round of applause for Kevin? Wonderful job. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. You know, listening to the conversation in this room, we have had wonderful evenings talking about John Hume and his contributions. We had a gathering here, which Kevin was at, where we looked at the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Accord and a wonderful partnership with the Consul General, and we are so deeply appreciative. And Leisha Moore, I want to welcome you again to Boston. Thank you. We look forward to many, many partnerships together with you. I want to thank all of you for being here this evening. Representative Honan, Representative Vieira, Jim Brett from the New England Council, Commissioner Gross, thank you for being with us. To this panel, it was just wonderful to hear the stories and the history, and all of you do. Ambassador, this is, I hope you consider this your home away from home. We always love having you at the Institute. Catherine, Damien, Daniel, thank you all for contributing to a very rich discussion. Commissioner, when you would have seen those pictures of Fenway Park, I don't know, you might have thought overflow capacity. There was 50,000 people, and I think the evening games allow 38. So there was, unless Bruce Springsteen is coming, we probably haven't seen such a large crowd at Fenway Park. But we welcome you here. We love these discussions, to be able to gather community and talk about how we build community, to talk about what it means to have a voice in the democratic process, to talk about the relationships that we have with partners. And I think about, on a personal level, just a few weeks ago, my brother came back from Ireland having taken his 4 children. They are 4th generation. And the attachment that they felt, the sense of going home, the sense of community, the sense of history, those important relationships exist for all of us who have been there, and we are so honored to have you here, sharing the stories, deepening those conversations, because collectively we do our best work together, and there is more that unites us than divides us. Thank you all for coming. I hope you will return. Thank you to the panel.